The car died in the middle of a sunlit country road so suddenly that Maren barely had time to steer it onto the shoulder. One moment the engine was humming beneath the bright late-morning sky, and the next it coughed twice, shuddered like something wounded, and went silent. Heat shimmered over the pavement ahead of her. Golden fields stretched on both sides of the road, and the nearest farmhouse looked miles away. Maren sat frozen behind the wheel with both hands wrapped around it, staring through the windshield as cars passed without slowing. She had already been fighting tears before the engine stopped. Now, with a folder of legal papers on the passenger seat, a dying phone in her purse, and a destination she was terrified to reach, the broken car felt like the final proof that the universe had decided she was not supposed to make it. Then an old dark green pickup passed her, braked hard 50 yards ahead, and reversed slowly along the shoulder. A man stepped out wearing faded work boots, a gray t-shirt, and the cautious expression of someone who knew better than to approach a stranded woman too quickly. He introduced himself as Rowan Mercer, asked whether she was all right, and when she told him the car had simply stopped, he crouched beside it, looked underneath, and then lowered himself onto the hot pavement. Maren watched this complete stranger slide beneath her broken car without hesitation, his shoulders disappearing into the shadow below the chassis. And less than 2 minutes later, when he asked her to hand him the small flashlight from his truck, Maren knelt beside the open door, looked at his grease-streaked hand reaching toward her, and whispered something that made him go perfectly still. She told him she recognized that hand, that if you believe kindness can find people on the worst days of their lives, and if you believe second chances sometimes arrive disguised as ordinary strangers, please like, comment, share this story, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Your support helps stories about compassion, hope, and unexpected human connections reach people who may need them more than we realize. Rowan slowly pushed himself out from under the car. Sunlight caught the fine dust in his dark hair, and a thin streak of grease crossed his cheek. He looked confused rather than frightened. Maren immediately regretted what she had said because there was no reasonable way to explain it without sounding strange. She pointed toward his right hand. Across the base of his thumb was a pale crescent-shaped scar. Beneath it, almost faded away, were 3 tiny blue dots from an old homemade tattoo. Rowan looked down at the marks as though he had forgotten they existed. Maren swallowed hard. 7 years earlier, in a hospital waiting room almost 200 miles away, she had held that same hand for nearly 3 hours. She had never learned the man's name. She had barely seen his face. But she remembered the scar because she had stared at it while her entire life seemed to collapse around her. Rowan's expression changed. The passing traffic, the summer insects, the ticking engine cooling beside them seemed to fade into the distance. He asked what hospital. When she named St. Agnes Medical Center, the color drained slightly from his face. 7 years earlier, Maren had been 24 and newly married. Her younger brother, Callum, had been injured in a highway accident during a violent afternoon storm. Maren had arrived at the emergency department alone because her husband had been 3 states away for work and her parents were traveling overseas. Nobody could tell her anything except that surgery had begun. She remembered sitting beneath harsh fluorescent lights, drenched from the rain, shaking so badly that she could barely hold a paper cup. Across from her had been a man in construction clothes with blood on his sleeve that was not his own. He had asked whether she had someone coming. She had said no. He had moved into the chair beside her without another word. When the surgeon eventually approached and Maren realized from his expression that the news would be terrible, she instinctively grabbed the stranger's hand. Callum survived, but suffered injuries that changed the course of his life. He spent months learning to walk properly again and years battling chronic pain. Through it all, Maren occasionally remembered the stranger who had stayed beside her until her family arrived. She remembered that hand because when everything inside her had been breaking apart, it had been the only steady thing in the room. Rowan sat back against the front tire of her car and stared across the bright fields. He remembered the day too. In fact, he remembered far more than Maren expected. Rowan had been the person who pulled Callum from the wreckage. He had been driving behind him when Callum's car hydroplaned across the highway and slammed into a concrete barrier. Rowan had stopped, climbed through shattered glass, and kept Callum conscious until paramedics arrived. The blood on Rowan's sleeve in the hospital waiting room had belonged to Maren's brother. Rowan had stayed because he had given a statement to police and because part of him needed to know whether the young driver lived. When Maren arrived, frantic and alone, he realized who she must be but could not bring himself to tell her that he had seen the crash. He had been afraid she would ask questions he could not answer without making her pain worse. So he had simply stayed. Maren lowered herself onto the gravel shoulder. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Above them, the sky was cloudless and painfully blue. A tractor moved slowly through a distant field. It was such an ordinary day for the world, yet Maren felt as though 7 years had suddenly folded in half. She had spent years wondering who that stranger had been, and now he had appeared again when her car failed on a road she had almost chosen not to travel. Rowan gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head and finally returned to the mechanical problem, perhaps because fixing machines was easier than explaining coincidences. He discovered that a loose connection near the fuel pump had worsened with vibration. It was something he could temporarily secure, but he warned her that the repair would not be safe for a long journey. The nearest garage was 8 miles away. Rowan offered to follow her there in case the engine stopped again. Maren thanked him, but her eyes drifted toward the passenger seat. Rowan noticed the thick folder of documents, the corner of one page stamped with the name of a family court. He did not ask. That restraint surprised her. Most people asked questions the moment they sensed pain. Rowan simply washed his hands with water from a bottle in his truck, tied the loose connection as securely as possible, and told her to start the engine. It turned over. Relief should have flooded through her, but instead Maren began crying. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quiet tears slipping down her face as the motor idled beneath her hands. Rowan remained outside the open driver's door. He did not tell her everything would be fine. He did not say she was strong. He did not offer the empty promises people reached for when they were uncomfortable around grief. He simply waited. Eventually Maren confessed that she was driving to a courthouse in a nearby town to sign the final documents ending her marriage. Her husband, Pierce, had left 8 months earlier after years of slowly becoming a stranger inside their home. There had been no dramatic betrayal, no explosive scandal, nothing Maren could point to and hate cleanly. Their marriage had disappeared through 1,000 quiet disappointments. Missed dinners. Unreturned affection. Arguments postponed until resentment became silence. Pierce eventually admitted he no longer wanted the life they had built together. That morning, Maren had packed the papers and driven toward the courthouse determined not to fall apart. The car breaking down had shattered that determination. Rowan listened from the roadside while sunlight moved across the hood. When she finished, he said that sometimes endings hurt more when nobody is clearly the villain because anger has nowhere to land. The observation struck Maren with such accuracy that she looked at him differently. Rowan explained that his wife had died 5 years earlier after a sudden illness. He had spent the first year furious at doctors, at himself, at the weather, at couples holding hands in grocery stores, at every ordinary person who seemed to have received another day with someone they loved. Eventually he understood that grief searched for somewhere to place blame because helplessness was harder to carry. He did not compare death with divorce. He simply told her that losing a future could hurt even when the person was still alive. They drove slowly toward the garage, Rowan's pickup following behind. Maren watched it repeatedly in her mirror. There was something comforting about knowing someone had chosen to stay close enough to help if she stopped again. At the garage, an elderly mechanic named Bryce inspected the car and told her the fuel pump itself was failing. It would take several hours to replace because the part had to come from another town. Maren immediately looked at the clock. Her appointment was in 90 minutes. Rowan was leaning against his truck when she came outside. He could tell from her face that something had gone wrong. Before she could ask, he offered to drive her to the courthouse. Maren refused at first. She had already taken enough of his day. Rowan glanced at the garage, then at the open highway, and reminded her that 7 years earlier she had once trusted him enough to hold his hand during the worst moment of her life. She could probably survive 40 minutes in his pickup. The drive unfolded beneath bright summer sunlight. They passed rows of corn, old barns, roadside produce stands, and small houses with laundry moving in the breeze. Maren expected awkwardness, but instead conversation arrived slowly and naturally. Rowan told her he repaired agricultural machinery and lived outside town in the farmhouse his grandparents had owned. Maren explained that she illustrated children's books from a small studio in her apartment. They spoke about Callum, who now worked as a rehabilitation counselor helping accident survivors. Rowan smiled when he learned that. For years he had wondered whether the young man from the wreck had eventually built a life. Hearing that Callum now helped others seemed to ease something Rowan had carried quietly. Then Maren asked a question that had bothered her since the roadside. Why had Rowan never introduced himself properly at the hospital? Why disappear without telling anyone what he had done? Rowan kept his eyes on the road for a long moment before answering. His father had raised him to believe that helping someone only counted if you did not turn it into a story about yourself. Rowan had watched people record charitable acts, announce favors, and collect gratitude like trophies. He never wanted to become that kind of person. Besides, he had not felt heroic. He had simply been the first person at the wreck. Maren looked through the windshield, suddenly thinking about how much of life happened unnoticed. A stranger pulled someone from a car. A nurse stayed 10 minutes past her shift. A neighbor carried groceries. A teacher remembered a frightened child years later. Most acts of goodness disappeared without applause, yet they changed the direction of people's lives. Callum's entire future existed partly because Rowan had stopped his truck on a rainy highway. Maren herself had survived the hospital waiting room because the same man had sat beside her. They reached the courthouse 20 minutes early. Rowan parked beneath a large maple tree. Maren placed her hand on the door handle but did not move. The building looked severe in the noon sun, all stone steps and rectangular windows. She confessed that part of her still wanted to turn around. Rowan did not tell her whether to sign the papers. Instead, he asked whether she wanted the marriage she actually had or the marriage she kept remembering. Maren closed her eyes. That question changed something. For months she had confused grief with doubt. She had imagined Pierce laughing in their first apartment, carrying boxes into their first home, sleeping beside her during thunderstorms, holding Callum's hand during physical therapy. She loved those memories. But memories were not a marriage. The man who had created them had gradually stopped choosing her, and Maren had spent years trying to preserve something that already existed mostly in photographs. She entered the courthouse alone. Rowan waited beneath the maple tree. Nearly an hour later, Maren emerged holding the folder against her chest. Her marriage was officially over. She had expected to feel empty. Instead she felt exhausted, sorrowful, strangely lighter, and almost guilty for the relief. Rowan did not ask what happened. He simply opened the passenger door of his truck. They stopped for lunch at a small roadside diner while the garage finished her repair. Through wide windows, sunlight flooded the booths. Families ate sandwiches. 2 construction workers argued cheerfully about baseball. Somewhere near the kitchen, a radio played softly. Nothing extraordinary happened. Yet years later, Maren would remember that lunch more clearly than many major events in her life. Rowan did not rescue her from sadness. He did something more useful. He allowed sadness to exist without trying to hurry it away. Before they left, Maren called Callum. She put the phone on speaker and told him she had found the man from the accident. For several seconds Callum said nothing. Then his voice cracked. He had always remembered a stranger kneeling beside his wrecked car in the rain, telling him to keep looking toward the sound of his voice. Callum had imagined meeting him hundreds of times. Rowan stood beside the pickup with one hand on the open door, visibly uncomfortable with the gratitude coming through the phone. Callum told him that after recovery, every good thing in his life had happened because somebody stopped. His career. His marriage. His young daughter. Every birthday after 22. Rowan lowered his head. Maren saw tears gather in his eyes. For the first time, she understood that the rescue had changed Rowan too. He admitted that the crash had haunted him for years. He remembered the sound of metal against concrete. He remembered wondering whether he had moved Callum incorrectly. He remembered waking at night convinced that perhaps he could have done more. Hearing Callum's voice, healthy and grown, released something Rowan had never known he was still carrying. The garage called shortly afterward. The car was repaired. By mid-afternoon Maren stood beside it with the road stretching homeward beneath bright sunlight. She expected to say goodbye to Rowan there. Perhaps that was what made their second unexpected connection feel even more meaningful. Rowan handed her a small folded receipt from the garage. On the back he had written his phone number. He told her not because destiny owed them some dramatic ending, but because strange days were easier when there was at least one person you could call. Maren smiled for the first time that day without forcing it. She did call him, not that evening. Not the next day. 3 weeks later, after she found a box of wedding photographs while cleaning her closet and suddenly felt unable to breathe, she called. Rowan answered. They talked for 20 minutes. Then he called her 2 weeks later when the anniversary of his wife's death arrived and the farmhouse felt unbearably quiet. Their friendship grew without urgency. Autumn replaced summer. Maren introduced Rowan to Callum, and the meeting happened at a backyard barbecue beneath yellow leaves, where Callum hugged the man who had saved his life and neither of them pretended not to cry. During winter, Rowan helped Maren move into a smaller apartment with better windows for her illustrations. In spring, she helped him repaint the kitchen his wife had chosen years earlier but which he had been afraid to change. Something tender formed between them, but neither rushed to name it. Their lives had taught them that love was not proven by speed or dramatic promises. Sometimes love began as someone following a damaged car down a country road to make sure it reached the garage. A year after the breakdown, Maren and Rowan returned to the same stretch of road almost accidentally while driving to visit Callum. Rowan recognized the shoulder first. He pulled over beneath the warm afternoon sun. They stood where her car had once failed, surrounded by tall summer grass moving in the wind. Maren looked at him and finally admitted what she had really meant that first day when she whispered that she recognized his hand. She had recognized more than a scar. She had recognized the feeling of being safe beside someone who expected nothing in return. Rowan reached for her hand. This time she took it without fear. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever been helped by someone who never asked for recognition, or if you've discovered that an ending can quietly become the beginning of something better, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who may be carrying invisible grief of their own. And before this story ends, comment "Someone stopped for me" if you still remember a person whose kindness appeared when you needed it most. 2 years later, Maren kept the old repair receipt inside a small wooden box beside her desk. The ink had faded, but Rowan's phone number was still visible on the back. Whenever someone asked how they met, people expected a romantic story. Maren usually smiled and said only that her car broke down on a sunny road. But the truth was bigger than that. A car had broken down. A marriage had ended. An old wound had reopened. A forgotten stranger had returned, and two people who thought they were simply surviving separate losses discovered that sometimes life does not repair what was broken by putting everything back the way it was. Sometimes it repairs us by sending someone who understands broken things, someone willing to stop, someone willing to crawl beneath the damage, someone willing to stay until the engine starts again, and sometimes, when we finally gather the courage to continue down the road, we look in the mirror and discover that we are no longer traveling alone.